Jacob Shapiro, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
The only policy prescription that I've heard the Trump administration make about the Middle East, there are really two. One is that Trump unequivocally supports Israel, and second, that Trump is going to absolutely destroy ISIS. And I want to talk about both of those right now. First off, and this is something I haven't heard a lot of analysis about, what really is the relationship between the U.S. and Israel now that Trump's in office? We know that the Obama administration did not have a good relationship, particularly with Netanyahu.
Again, all of this falls under the rubric of you really shouldn't pay any attention to what Donald Trump says, and you should forget everything he said during the campaign, and you should forget everything he tweets and everything he's going to say. So yes, he said he was unequivocally for Israel, but we already saw that he chastised them for settlements, and that's already changed some of Netanyahu's behavior with settlements. And he also said that he was going to move the capital, or move the embassy to Jerusalem. He hasn't done that either. So, Trump says these things, and he was probably doing that to cater to votes. And then when he's in office, he sees that things are a lot more complex. I would say the way to analyze the relationship between the United States and Israel is to remember that the U.S. and Israel were not always close allies, that alliance really started in 1967 after the Israelis proved that their military was capable of handling some of those Arab nations around them, and Israel became a main Cold War ally of the United States. It's one of the main bulwarks in the region for the United States to push back against the Soviet Union, which had excellent relationships with Egypt, with Syria, a lot of these Arab countries. So the Soviet Union's not there anymore. And Russia, for all of its dilly-dallying around Syria, really isn't doing that much in the Middle East. So the hard strategic basis of that relationship is really not there. That doesn't mean that Israel and the United States aren't allies. It doesn't mean that they're not very good friends in lots of different ways. It's just to say that the United States has interests and Israel has interests. We saw this with the Iran nuclear deal. Israel really, really didn't want it. The United States wanted it, and that's just the way it works. Israel's probably more secure and more powerful than it has ever been in its history today. I sort of think they're probably at the max point, so they have maximum independence of action, but they still know where their bread is buttered. They still know they can't piss off the United States, and Netanyahu feels like he can work with Trump in a way that he couldn't feel like he could steamroll Obama. So I would say you have two allies who don't quite see eye to eye anymore, but broadly are together. But at the end of the day, the United States will do what the United States does, and what Israel wants is not in the top three lists of things that are important to the United States, even under Trump.
So Israel obviously has to be concerned about the security situation in the region. There seems to be conflict on almost all of its borders at this point. Do you see a day where that conflict is eventually going to at least touch on Israel's borders?
It has to. If you talk to any Israeli or if you read any of the press out of Israel, they'll all say Hezbollah is the biggest threat. I think that's a little overblown. Hezbollah is deeply involved in the Syrian civil war. They've committed a lot of forces there. There's even internal strife in Hezbollah about that. They don't have time for a conflict with Israel. For Israel, one of the major issues is what if something reconstitutes itself where Syria is right now that could attack them. That's something they have to start thinking about down the line. It's hard to imagine now that the Syrian civil war is going to end. It will end at some point. There will be some power there at some point. It'll probably take decades, though. I think when you think long-term about what Israel's threats are, it's really none of this chaos in the Arab world. I'm not saying that they can dismiss that, but if you look at what the Israelis are doing, one of the things that's really struck me is they're buying submarines from the Germans. They're modernizing their navy. The only reason I could see for them doing that is Turkey. Turkey is right there. Turkey's going through a lot of stuff of its own. When you think out 20 or 30 years, who's going to be the main power in this region? It's Turkey. And you want to make sure that your military capabilities can handle what that kind of power is going to mean. And then the other one is the one that Netanyahu talks about all the time and has really used to stake his electoral stability, which is Iran. Iran is much less capable of threatening Israel directly, but as Iran gets stronger, and as it starts pushing, more money to those militant groups like Hezbollah, that's a major threat to Israel. So I think all the stuff in the Arab world Israel has to worry about. I didn't even mention Egypt, which was for a long time was the biggest enemy, and we know things aren't completely stable there. There were 2 or 3 years there during the Muslim Brotherhood Morsi government that Israel was thinking about redeploying and new divisions down south. But overall, I think when Israel looks at this scene, the chaos in the Arab world is important, but I think they're looking longer term. I think they're looking at the bigger powers that are playing in this region and what Israel's security 20, 30 years from now needs to look like.
Let's go to Trump's other policy declaration, if you might call it that, and that is to utterly, and he's used many different terms, destroy totally. I don't even think he's used the term degrade. I think he said, obliterate ISIS. How realistic is that? And really, does the U.S. even have the assets in the region to do that if that's truly what they want?
It's two separate questions with ISIS. Certainly the United States has the ability to wipe out the Islamic State's caliphate in Syria and Iraq. The United States military is a little overtaxed, but Mattis is going to get a lot of money back into modernizing the military. We're already seeing some more U.S. military forces on the ground. If the United States wanted, I don't want to minimize how much it would take, but they could take out the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. The problem with the Islamic State, though, is that it's an expression of radical Islam. So, when everybody is getting upset with, or was getting upset with former President Obama about not mentioning radical Islam, for me, the real reason that it was a mistake not to say radical Islam was because you're not identifying the thing that you're actually fighting with. It's not a fight with the Islamic State. The Islamic State is just the latest iteration. It was Al-Qaeda before. Al-Qaeda's still around. People have been focusing so much on the Islamic State that Al-Qaeda is being ignored, and they have a little fiefdom of their own in Syria where they're doing stuff. So yes, you can wipe out the Islamic State and you can wipe out these particular leaders, but it's a game of whack-a-mole. This ideology is all over the place. There's no economic progress. There's no economic stability. There are no prospects for the young people in these regions, and they turn to Islam as something that is meaningful, and it gives them identity, and it gives them some form of security. It might even give them bread for their children. If the father of the family goes and blows up a suicide bomb. So until you're able to tackle that issue, sure, you can blow up as many of them as you want. And the United States has gotten very good at blowing Muslims up in the Middle East. It's not going to actually fix the problem.
Okay, this is going to sound maybe a bit odd, but we might eventually get there. Can you see the day where the United States eventually sits down with some iteration of ISIS or whatever it becomes into, and actually negotiates with them to figure out some sort of final solution? Because is it, as you say, is it realistic to assume that you're going to be able to destroy something, basically an ideology, via military means? At some point, you're going to have to sit down and actually negotiate with these people.
That depends much more on ISIS than it does in the United States. I think one of the reasons Al-Qaeda in Syria has changed its names 4 different times is because they're signaling, we're maybe a little more rational than these crazy guys over here. Maybe you want to deal with us. One of the things I always say when people ask me questions like this is that the original ISIS, or the original Islamic State, was Saudi Arabia. I mean, Wahhabism is a completely conservative, radical reading of Islam. And, the Saudis have changed. They discovered oil and they became very rich, and they've discovered Audis and Porsches and Cuban cigars and all these other things, and they don't let their people know that they've discovered these things, but that's what they do. And you saw them go from a radical, Wahhabist ideology to really what it is now, which is petrodollars and money and only the appearance of religion. So the question there is really, is the Islamic State, or are some of these entities going to moderate themselves enough such that the United States on a pragmatic basis can deal with some of them? In the case of ISIS, I think not. ISIS is really beyond the pale. I think they really are religious fanatics. I think the leadership really believes in it. I think that the rank and followers really believe it. I don't think there's really any negotiation with ISIS. But you can certainly imagine the United States partnering with groups that 10, 20 years ago you wouldn't have imagined the United States partnering with. Remember that Osama bin Laden learned many of the things that he learned from the United States, because the United States saw fit to cooperate with bin Laden and anybody else who could, because the U.S. was fighting the Cold War, and that was the most important thing in Afghanistan. So certainly, people should not be surprised with the level of pragmatism in American foreign policy. In some ways, pragmatism is, the great American philosophy.
Well, great analysis, Jacob. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Become a RiskHedge insider for free by visiting RiskHedge.com. Each week, you'll receive vital analysis on today's geopolitical, financial, and social risks. Just visit RiskHedge.com today to become a RiskHedge insider.